Lawmakers pushed to oust Donald Trump after accusing him of inciting insurrection.
USA! USA!
The world watched in disbelief as rioters attacked the heart of American democracy. If they were emboldened by an embattled president, should he be forced from office? I'm Ali Aslan, and today on the Newsmakers, we look at the storming of the US Capitol and its aftermath. As Congress was confirming Joe Biden's election victory, an armed mob of Trump supporters stormed the Capitol to stop it. The last time Congress came under attack, it was British soldiers in 1814. This time, hundreds breached the Capitol building, forcing lawmakers to seek shelter. But what led to the violent chaos in the first place? Democrats blame President Donald Trump, accusing him of inciting the crowd with his rhetoric and false claims of electoral fraud. Some Republicans are slamming the president too. Several members of Trump's inner circle have resigned, and the vice president has been urged to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove the once prolific tweeter from power. If he doesn't, Democrats have promised to proceed with impeachment. So, how did we get to this point? Natalie Pahonen explores.
We're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol. Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
For months, President Donald Trump told supporters the November election was stolen. A baseless claim and one that has been repudiated by courts across the country. Yet he used it as a clarion call to action that turned into deadly mob violence. Rioters stormed the very halls of power that represent the people in this democracy, halting the routine constitutional process that was taking place to officially declare the winner of the election, Joe Biden. Shots were fired inside the Capitol. The Confederate flag was paraded through the building. Trump loyalists declared this was their house. The president eventually called on his supporters to leave, but not before telling them he loved them and that they were very special. This attempt to disrupt the peaceful transition of power was stopped. January 6, 2021 is a date which will live in infamy. Many Americans, and indeed the rest of the world, are left to ask, just how did it come to this? Over the course of the Trump presidency, politics appears to have been used to drive divisions, not to solve problems. It's left America in a more polarized state than perhaps ever before. When the nation has looked to its commander-in-chief for reassurance and political leadership, the results have often been confounding. After a woman was killed at a far-right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in August 2017, Trump was called on to condemn the violence.
They showed up in Charlottesville.
Excuse me, they had let themselves down this year, and you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Last year, this is how he responded at the presidential debate when called on to denounce white supremacy.
Want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it. You want to call him? What do you want to call him? Give me a name. Give me a
White
name.
supremacists and
Who would
white
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud
militia.
Boys, stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, because this is not a right-wing problem. This is a left-wing. This is a left-wing problem.
Us and them. That's a message that has resonated with a significant part of his base and indeed supporters inside the Republican Party throughout the course of the Trump administration. And it's a theme he has turned to again and again. Ahead of the 2020 vote, Trump made constant allegations that the election would be rigged. After polling day, he was joined by prominent political figures and right-wing media outlets that repeatedly aired false accusations of mass voter fraud. At the same time, some GOP politicians across different levels of government didn't speak up against those claims. It all contributed to whipping up anger and further fueling discord along the way. The assault on the Capitol was the culmination of that division.
Charge the Capitol!
There are investigations into the practicalities of how the area was breached, and authorities have arrested dozens of people they say were involved in the riot. But the bigger question for the US is how to address what was once an unthinkable attack on democracy itself. Natalie Pahanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, the scenes from that riot were shocking, but who bears ultimate responsibility? To discuss that, let's go to Washington, D.C., where I am joined by Jason Osborne. He's a political strategist and was a senior advisor on Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. Steve Simeonidis is a lawyer and chair of the Miami-Dade Democrats, and Mitch Lerner is a professor of American history at Ohio State University. Gentlemen, welcome after a very eventful, historic and groundbreaking week that we have put behind us. Jason, you worked on Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, helped him get elected, so to speak. Who bears ultimate responsibility for these unprecedented scenes that we just witnessed in Washington, D.C.?
Well, first off, let me just say roll tide to both of my fellow panelists here. I think, honestly, we've reached a point in American politics where it's become so divisive on both sides. I think Donald Trump, certainly with his rhetoric, took it a little bit, well, took it too far, not a little bit. I certainly don't think that he anticipated the type of scene that we saw last week. I think he was anticipating that folks would go to Congress and stand outside, just like the other side has done several times, and make their voice heard. Certainly the scenes we saw with them breaking into the Capitol, I used to work on Capitol Hill. In fact, my former boss's office was one of those that folks went into. I do think that we need some further examination of how we come back from this and how we become more civil towards each other.
But if I understand you correctly, Jason, you wouldn't solely and exclusively place blame on the president himself.
No, I mean, I think he certainly riled up the crowd. There's no question. But to put blame on one person, and I would say this to the other side on any of their demonstrations, to put blame on one person, I think, is a little bit too much, because we're supposed to be responsible for our own actions. I mean, I had friends that went down to the speech, but they didn't go down to Congress. I think there was a peaceful protest anticipated, and then folks took it too far. And there's certainly elements of the far right that, need to be curtailed and need to be prosecuted, just as I would say on any of the protests that have occurred around the country over the last 3-4 years. If you violate the law, then you need to be prosecuted.
Steve, there's no doubt on the part of the Democrats who is to blame for these events. They're certainly blaming the president and are calling for his immediate removal. We've grown accustomed, all of us, to the rhetoric of the president over the last 4 years. But did you ever expect that events would unfold to such a degree?
I mean, I was both surprised and it was both a surprising act and one that was so expected based on the last 4 years of his rhetoric. We had 4 years of him feeding in to the divisiveness of this communication strategy, and we had media outlets like Fox News also feeding this violent incitement of violence for the past 4 years that finally culminated in this awful act. I mean, this was a coordinated violent insurrection incited by the President of the United States. They planted bombs, they beat police officers to death, and they stormed our Capitol building with zip ties ready to hold lawmakers hostage. Donald Trump is a danger to our democracy, and he must be removed immediately before he can cause even further harm.
And that is certainly what the Democrats are aiming to do during the very last few days in his office. Mitch, You are, of course, a very astute observer of U.S. politics and certainly have seen your shares of outstanding and extraordinary events. This is one that probably ranks near the top, doesn't it?
Oh, God, yes. There's not been anything like this, really, I think, since the American Civil War. I mean, we can go back to the violence of the 1960s, and there was some political price to be paid there for the Democratic Party. But there's never been anything like this, and what makes it different, and I have to sort of call out your first guest a little bit here. I was thrilled to hear Jason condemn the violence. I think we all do, and that's terrific. But he's going back to this false narrative of both sides do it, and there's extremists on both sides. What makes this different, what makes the current Republican leadership different from what we've seen in the past, what makes the events of the last week different, is that they're a direct frontal attack on the democratic process. Now, like him, I condemn violence everywhere. I know there were violence at some of the civil rights protests this summer. The difference, of course, is that those protests were, first of all, rooted in legitimate grievances, while these protests are a complete barrage of falsehoods and lies, and people have been manipulated into it. But more than that, the people protesting in Portland or Seattle or whatever it was were protesting at least for a legitimate cause. What happened in Washington, D.C., for the first time in maybe 150 years, we saw a direct attack on the democratic process. And so any sort of their side has some responsibility or all sides do it and everybody needs to tone it down really minimizes the incredible role played by the Republican Party's leadership over the last few years to bring us to this unprecedented moment.
And indeed, picking up on what Mitch said, Jason, many prominent Republicans and even cabinet members of Donald Trump have taken these events as, if you will, as a reason to resign. Many of his staunch backers are turning their backs on him. Has he overdone it in this particular incident, even by Donald Trump standards?
Look, I think to what your previous guy just said, there is some legitimacy in the sense that in this election, the optics of the election process was skewed. I'm not saying that there was massive fraud that would have overturned their election. And don't shake your head, because the reality is, if you're looking as an American and you're looking at the process and you're seeing vote totals come in that don't seem right, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying there's fraud, but I think the narrative that we had going into this election was going to be bad. And I think we as Republicans, and certainly Donald Trump took it to an extreme, but we as Republicans didn't confront this right away and give Americans assurances that no matter what, the process of our election system was going to be intact. You can go and you can sue and you can say that there was fraud and there's no cases of fraud. But the reality is, in our system, there's small amounts of fraud in every election. There's dead people that suddenly appear on the voter rolls. They may not have changed the election, but it's the appearance of it that we needed as the Republican Party and the Democrat Party moving forward, that we need to actually make sure that everything is transparent so that we don't have this situation again. And we certainly don't have somebody that is inflaming the rhetoric. And I would say that Fox News, to the guy from Miami, yeah, they inflamed it, but then they turned. There's no place in politics right now for people to sit there and inflame the tensions. I think we need to calm down in how we explain our rhetoric. But there was the optics of a flawed system that we need to address.
And address it.
I'm sorry,
go ahead, Mitch.
Can I respond to that? Because it's just ridiculous. So two problems here with what he's saying. First of all, to the extent that there is this narrative out there of there being fraud in the election, it's because the Republicans keep putting it forward, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You keep screaming that there's going to be fraud, and then you look for fraud and you don't find it, but you've put it out there so that people can constantly say, well, there is suspicion, we need to keep looking for it, even though there is none. And the reality is, this is an empirical fact. We have investigated this over and over again. Ali, every time the Republicans lose an election, they start screaming that there was voter fraud. In 2000,
4 years ago, Hillary Clinton said that she won the election. Stacey Abrams still has not conceded her election 4 years ago.
Finish.
I'm not saying that there's fraud. I'm saying the optics
Jason
of the system are bad.
Steve, go ahead.
What
The
we're seeing
optics
from
are bad.
Jason here is it's a classic KGB propaganda technique. He's using whataboutism. He's saying, well, don't look at this. Don't look at the violent insurrection started by Donald Trump. Take a look at the protest by the left. Look at Donald Trump don't look at Donald Trump not refusing to accept the results of the election. Look at Hillary Clinton. Look at Stacey Abrams. He's not actually answering the question or looking at the problem at hand. We're talking again about a violent insurrection incited by Donald Trump. There was no election fraud that would have overturned this election. The state certified it. Filed 42 lawsuits. You lost every single one. Congress certified it. The vice president certified it. The Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, the GOP Mitch McConnell, said that he believes in the election results. Your argument is wrong, and you're just further inflaming what caused the insurrection this past week.
First of all, I condemned it from the very beginning. I said from the very beginning that I didn't think that there was fraud enough to overturn any election. What I'm saying is that there's not trust in the system. I'm not saying that there's massive fraud.
The reason there's no trust in the system
I'm saying the opposite of it.
Tell us why there isn't trust in the system. There's a distrust in the system because your party keeps falsely claiming that there's fraud. In 2016,
can you not admit that Hillary never conceded the election?
Of course, Hillary Clinton gave a concession speech the day after the election. In 2016,
she has said for 4 years she should have been president.
Why are we discussing Hillary Clinton, though? That was 4 years ago, and she did concede. Let's focus on Donald Trump and the fact that he just incited an insurrection. There is no precedent for that.
And Steve, as a matter of fact, let's focus on the next steps here, because the Democrats had made it very clear that they are calling for Trump's immediate removal. They want to make him the very first president in U.S. history to be impeached twice. How realistic do you think this process will go?
I think it's all but guaranteed that he'll be impeached. The question is whether or not the people in the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate, because we'll wind up needing approximately 16 of them to vote in favor of impeachment, whether or not they will agree that his incitement of this insurrection, where police officers died, where bombs were planted, will be enough to remove him. And I cannot think of anything more deserving of being removed as the president of the United States than inciting an insurrection to go against election results when you had just lost.
Mitch, preceding these events, it was quite likely that Donald Trump, even not being the president, would be quite influential still, a very influential voice within the Republican Party. After these events, also with the hindsight of 2024, probably second Trump presidency, I think that one we can lay to rest, no?
Well, let's hope so. I mean, nobody really knows. I think that what we're going to see over the next few years is an internal battle inside the Republican Party. And I made reference earlier to the 1960s, and we saw this with the Democratic Party in the wake of the 1968 protests, turned a little violent in the middle of the election, alienated a lot of the mainstream American voter. And I think that's what's happening right now. Republicans, both the leadership and Republicans in the streets of the United States, are going to have to decide where their loyalties lie. For a long time, the Republican Party, and I disagree with a lot of their policies, whether that be, gay marriage or climate change or whatever it happens to be, but they were at least a legitimate party of ideas. They've transformed into a cult of personality. If Trump can maintain his hold, he's implying that he's going to create his own media service. He's certainly going to stay active unless, of course, he's in prison, because there are lots of signs that the attorney generals in the region in New York have a lot of evidence against him, and he's going to go through some legal difficulties. But he's certainly going to try to remain in the limelight. And I think the Republican Party is about to go through a real battle for the soul of the future.
And Jason, do you even fear, as some experts might have suggested, that the Republican Party might even split? The hardcore Trump supporters might even split from the party and chart their own course?
Well, I think you have to look at who splits. I mean, if we're talking about the people that stormed the Capitol, I certainly don't want them part of the party. I mean, I'm looking at, having worked for Dr. Carson before I worked for Dr. Trump, for Donald Trump, not Dr. Trump, I saw people come out to in the primary system that we had never seen before. I mean, the people that had their voices hadn't been heard by politicians on either side. And I'm not talking about, again, the radical far right here. I'm talking about middle America in Iowa, Michigan, Wisconsin, folks that just had given up on politicians even talking to them or understanding what they're going through. And I think the Republican Party needs to focus on those voters, the folks that hadn't come out to vote in the past. And I think they need to work on diversifying and certainly speaking to the minority communities better. I'm not worried so much about, Donald Trump coming in and taking over the party, because I just don't think that's going to happen. I don't think he has the temperament to do it. I don't think he has the willingness to do it. I think he's going to try and go back and rebuild his business. So I think we're going to go back and do an examination, a better examination of the party on a state-by-state basis and figure out how do we speak to Americans on all sides of the issue, and how do we get our message across better? Because I think the narrative originally was lost on us. And that's one of the big problems we have as Republicans, is that it takes us a minute or two to explain an issue when the other side is able to spat out, a 5-10 second theme and make us seem like we're not in touch with real life.
And certainly Donald Trump will have a much tougher time to get his message across in the time to come, Steve, because as a direct consequence and result of the events in Washington, D.C., social media platforms, most notably Twitter, of course, have expelled the president. Aside from the fact that you, of course, fundamentally disagree with him politically, do you think that is a wise move? Do you think silencing, if you will, to a certain extent, expelling a sitting president or an influential voice from Twitter is the right move here?
Absolutely. I mean, when he's using his Twitter account to incite violent insurrection that is causing law officers to lose their lives, that is causing people to storm the Capitol, I absolutely think it's the bare minimum that we should be doing to be able to strip him of that megaphone that he's using to incite this violence and this treason.
And Mitch, obviously, he's tried to shift this message to Parler. Parler then again has got bad from Google, from Apple. So certainly on the part of social media platforms, there's a concerted effort not to give this man, not to give the 45th president of the United States any more social media platforms. The academic in you, the American in you, what does he think?
With regard to the decision to drive him off social media, I think that it's an unfortunate necessity. I think that we are all, particularly as an academic, I embrace the free exchange of ideas. All viewpoints need to be welcome. This is what makes the system work. And yet at the same time, you reach a point where, as Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, you can't falsely scream fire in a crowded movie theater because you fundamentally imperil the lives of your fellow citizens. And that's what's going on here. Somebody had to step in. I frankly think that the problem is that these accounts didn't step in and didn't intercede earlier. And it reminds me very much, you mentioned earlier the rats fleeing the sinking ship, his cabinet members resigning and the Republican Party leadership condemning him. Where was this all a few months ago when he was whipping up these ridiculous allegations of fraud that everybody knew weren't real and were just designed to inflame his base and got us to this moment? So if anything, I think not only is this the right thing to do, but it and other steps needed to be taken earlier so we could have avoided the horror show that we saw a few days ago.
Jason, before we go, these were some truly lively 4 years, to put it mildly. You, of course, helped and assisted the 2016 presidential campaign of Donald Trump. Knowing everything now that you know now, if you had known back then, is this a candidate, is this a politician, is this a campaign you still would have been part of?
I think I did the right thing in 2016. I made the decision not to join the 2020 campaign, and I stand by that. I mean, I'm not going to take back what I did 4 years ago because I saw something both in Dr. Carson when I initially joined his campaign and worked on that I think there was an element, of America that was not getting their voice heard. And again, I'm not talking about the Proud Boys or the white supremacists, because I certainly want nothing to do with any of them and their message. But I think going back to your point on banning on Twitter, I think maybe it was the right decision, but I also think we have to be consistent in some of this stuff. And when we have the Iranian folks asking for the persecution of Jewish citizens, and we have Louis Farrakhan, I think we have to do this across the board for folks that are inciting violence on all levels. And Donald Trump, certainly losing Twitter is going to impact him. And I don't know if he's going to set up another system, but it's not going to work. I mean, it's not going to have the same flavor that Twitter does.
Well, certainly historic, unprecedented events that we have seen in Washington, D.C. And I take it that it's going to take America some time, a divided America, some time to heal. Well, that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers. Jason Osborne, Steve Simeonidis, and Mitch Lerner, thank you so much for joining us and providing some backdrop and insights into these historic events. I'm Ali Aslan. Thanks for watching.